They laughed when I couldn't figure out the tent stakes, rolled their eyes when I asked about the water source, and whispered behind my back about city folk who had no business in the wilderness. But when the park ranger arrived and called me by my old rank, when he said those two words that changed everything, the entire dynamic shifted in ways none of them could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung over Pine Ridge Family Campground like a wet blanket, and I could already feel the judgment seeping through the fabric of my borrowed sleeping bag. Day 3 of what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway with my sister's family, and I was beginning to wonder why I'd agreed to this torture in the first place. The concrete jungle of downtown Chicago had been my home for the past 15 years, and apparently that showed in every awkward movement I made around this campsite. "Sarah, honey, you're holding the compass upside down again," called out Derek Morrison, our self-appointed group leader and my sister's brother-in-law. He had that particular brand of condescending cheerfulness that made you want to punch something soft and squishy. Derek wore his outdoor expertise like a badge of honor, complete with a vest covered in patches from every national park he'd ever visited, hiking boots that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a beard that he stroked whenever he was about to dispense wilderness wisdom to us lesser mortals. I turned the compass right side up without comment, though I could have told him that magnetic declination in this area meant the reading was off by about 12 degrees anyway. But explaining that would require admitting I knew something about navigation, and I'd learned over the past few days that any display of competence on my part seemed to threaten Derek's carefully constructed image as the group's survival guru. "Don't worry about it," chirped my sister Jenny, bless her heart. "Remember, Sarah's more of an indoor person. Coffee shops and bookstores, right, sis?" She meant well, but each attempt to defend me just reinforced the narrative that had formed around me since we'd arrived. Sarah the city girl. Sarah the indoor cat. Sarah who probably couldn't start a fire if her life depended on it. If only they knew. The group consisted of 3 families, all connected through Derek's extensive network of outdoor enthusiast friends. There was Derek and his wife Patricia, who treated camping like a competitive sport where style points mattered as much as functionality. Their matching RAI everything screamed more money than sense, and Patricia had spent the first day rearranging their campsite until it looked like something out of a catalog. Then there were the Hendersons, Mark and Linda, with their twin teenage boys who seemed to view the entire trip as an interruption to their gaming schedules. Mark was Derek's hiking buddy, the kind of guy who measured every trail in terms of difficulty level and elevation gain, while Linda spent most of her time trying to get cell service to post Instagram photos of their authentic wilderness experience. My sister Jenny and her husband Mike rounded out the group with their 8-year-old daughter Emma, who was the only person here who didn't seem to care that I couldn't tie a proper bowline knot or that I'd packed the wrong kind of sleeping bag for the temperature. Emma just wanted someone to help her catch fireflies and tell her stories about the stars, which were about the only camping activities I felt comfortable with so far. The campsite itself was beautiful, I had to admit. Tall pines stretched toward a sky so blue it looked artificial, and the nearby stream provided a constant soundtrack of rushing water over smooth stones. The air smelled like pine needles and wood smoke, with that crisp edge that only comes from being far away from car exhaust and city pollution. Under different circumstances, I might have actually enjoyed it, but these weren't different circumstances. These were circumstances where every mistake I made became evidence of my incompetence, where every question I asked was met with eye rolls and dramatic sighs, where Derek took every opportunity to demonstrate his superior outdoor knowledge at my expense. The thing about wilderness survival, Derek was saying now, addressing the group but clearly directing his comments at me, is that it's not something you can learn from books or videos. It's about instinct, about understanding the natural world in a way that only comes from years of experience. He gestured broadly at the forest around us, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd come to dread. Take water procurement, for instance. Most people think you can just drink from any stream, but a real outdoorsman knows to look for signs of contamination, to understand the ecosystem, to read the landscape like a map. I nodded along politely, though I could have told him that the stream we were camped beside showed clear signs of beaver activity upstream, which meant potential giardia contamination, and that the slightly oily sheen near the bank suggested possible agricultural runoff from the valley below. But explaining that would require admitting I knew something about navigation, and I'd learned over the past few days that any display of competence on my part seemed to threaten Derek's carefully constructed image as the group's survival guru. "Don't worry about it," chirped my sister Jenny, bless her heart. "Remember, Sarah's more of an indoor person. Coffee shops and bookstores, right, sis?" She meant well, but each attempt to defend me just reinforced the narrative that had formed around me since we'd arrived. Sarah the city girl. Sarah the indoor cat. Sarah who probably couldn't start a fire if her life depended on it. If only they knew. The group consisted of 3 families, all connected through Derek's extensive network of outdoor enthusiast friends. There was Derek and his wife Patricia, who treated camping like a competitive sport where style points mattered as much as functionality. Their matching REI everything screamed more money than sense, and Patricia had spent the first day rearranging their campsite until it looked like something out of a catalog. Then there were the Hendersons, Mark and Linda, with their twin teenage boys who seemed to view the entire trip as an interruption to their gaming schedules. Mark was Derek's hiking buddy, the kind of guy who measured every trail in terms of difficulty level and elevation game, while Linda spent most of her time trying to get cell service to post Instagram photos of their authentic wilderness experience. My sister Jenny and her husband Mike rounded out the group with their 8-year-old daughter Emma, who was the only person here who didn't seem to care that I couldn't tie a proper bowline knot or that I'd packed the wrong kind of sleeping bag for the temperature. Emma just wanted someone to help her catch fireflies and tell her stories about the stars, which were about the only camping activities I felt comfortable with so far. The campsite itself was beautiful, I had to admit. Tall pines stretched toward a sky so blue it looked artificial, and the nearby stream provided a constant soundtrack of rushing water over smooth stones. The air smelled like pine needles and wood smoke, with that crisp edge that only comes from being far away from car exhaust and city pollution. Under different circumstances, I might have actually enjoyed it. But these weren't different circumstances. These were circumstances where every mistake I made became evidence of my incompetence, where every question I asked was met with eye rolls and dramatic sighs, where Derek took every opportunity to demonstrate his superior outdoor knowledge at my expense. The thing about wilderness survival, Derek was saying now, addressing the group but clearly directing his comments at me, is that it's not something you can learn from books or videos. It's about instinct, about understanding the natural world in a way that only comes from years of experience. He gestured broadly at the forest around us, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd come to dread. Take water procurement, for instance. Most people think you can just drink from any stream, but a real outdoorsman knows to look for signs of contamination, to understand the ecosystem, to read the landscape like a map. I nodded along politely, though I could have told him that the stream we were camped beside showed clear signs of beaver activity upstream, which meant potential giardia contamination, and that the slightly oily sheen near the bank suggested possible agricultural runoff from the valley below. But explaining that would require admitting I knew something about navigation, and I'd learned over the past few days that any display of competence on my part seemed to threaten Derek's carefully constructed image as the group's survival guru. "Don't worry about it," chirped my sister Jenny, bless her heart. "Remember, Sarah's more of an indoor person. Coffee shops and bookstores, right, sis?" She meant well, but each attempt to defend me just reinforced the narrative that had formed around me since we'd arrived. Sarah the city girl. Sarah the indoor cat. Sarah who probably couldn't start a fire if her life depended on it. If only they knew. The group consisted of 3 families, all connected through Derek's extensive network of outdoor enthusiast friends. There was Derek and his wife Patricia, who treated camping like a competitive sport where style points mattered as much as functionality. Their matching REI everything screamed more money than sense, and Patricia had spent the first day rearranging their campsite until it looked like something out of a catalog. Then there were the Hendersons, Mark and Linda, with their twin teenage boys who seemed to view the entire trip as an interruption to their gaming schedules. Mark was Derek's hiking buddy, the kind of guy who measured every trail in terms of difficulty level and elevation game, while Linda spent most of her time trying to get cell service to post Instagram photos of their authentic wilderness experience. My sister Jenny and her husband Mike rounded out the group with their 8-year-old daughter Emma, who was the only person here who didn't seem to care that I couldn't tie a proper bowline knot or that I'd packed the wrong kind of sleeping bag for the temperature. Emma just wanted someone to help her catch fireflies and tell her stories about the stars, which were about the only camping activities I felt comfortable with so far. The campsite itself was beautiful, I had to admit. Tall pines stretched toward a sky so blue it looked artificial, and the nearby stream provided a constant soundtrack of rushing water over smooth stones. The air smelled like pine needles and wood smoke, with that crisp edge that only comes from being far away from car exhaust and city pollution. Under different circumstances, I might have actually enjoyed it. But these weren't different circumstances. These were circumstances where every mistake I made.
Everyone participates, we all learn something, and we get a better sense of where everyone stands in terms of capabilities. My stomach dropped. A skills assessment. Under Derek's watchful eye with the whole group as an audience. There was no way to gracefully decline without confirming every negative assumption they'd already made about me. That sounds like a great idea, Patricia chimed in, always eager to support her husband's initiatives. Like a fun team-building exercise. I love it, added Linda Henderson, probably already planning how to document it for social media. Very empowering. Jenny looked uncertain, glancing between Derek and me like she was trying to gauge whether this was a good idea. Mike, bless him, just looked tired. He'd been working double shifts at the hospital for months, and this trip was supposed to be his chance to relax, not navigate family dynamics and prove his wilderness worthiness. What kind of assessment? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Derek's grin widened. Oh, just the basics. Fire starting without modern tools, water procurement and purification, basic first aid, shelter construction, navigation without GPS. You know, the fundamentals that everyone should know if they're going to spend time in the wilderness. Each item on his list hit me like a small electric shock. These weren't basic skills for weekend campers. These were serious survival competencies, the kind of things they taught in military survival schools and search and rescue training programs. Derek was either showing off his own extensive knowledge or testing to see just how incompetent I really was. Sounds challenging, I said carefully. I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of instruction. That's exactly why we need to do it, Derek replied, his tone growing more insistent. Look, I'm not trying to embarrass anyone, but if we're going to be out here together, we need to know what we're working with. What if something happens? What if we get separated from the main trails? What if there's an emergency? He gestured toward the surrounding forest, which suddenly seemed less picturesque and more ominous under his description. This isn't a city park, Sarah. This is serious wilderness. People die out here when they're not prepared, when they don't have the necessary skills. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention. Jenny looked worried, probably imagining me failing spectacularly at basic survival tasks. The Hendersons seemed mildly entertained, like they were watching a reality show. Patricia was already setting up her phone to record whatever was about to happen. And Derek stood there with his arms crossed, waiting for my response, clearly confident that he was about to demonstrate once and for all why city people had no business in the wilderness. I looked around at their faces, at the expectation and judgment and barely concealed amusement, and felt something shift inside me. Something that had been sleeping for 15 years, something that remembered what it felt like to be underestimated by people who had no idea what they were dealing with. All right, I said quietly. Let's do your assessment. The reaction was immediate. Patricia clapped her hands together excitedly. Linda Henderson started adjusting her phone angle for better video coverage. The teenage boys looked up from their devices with sudden interest, clearly hoping to witness some spectacular failure. Jenny bit her lip nervously while Mike just shook his head with a slight smile. And Derek? Derek looked like Christmas morning had come early. Excellent, he said, rubbing his hands together. This is going to be educational for everyone. We'll start with something simple. Fire building using only natural materials. No matches, no lighters, no modern conveniences. He led us to a small clearing about 20 yards from our main campsite, where he'd apparently been planning this demonstration all along.
A neat pile of various wood sizes sat arranged by type, along with what looked like several different options for tinder and kindling. Now, the key to primitive fire starting, Derek began, slipping into instructor mode, is understanding the fire triangle: heat, fuel, and oxygen. Without all three components in the right proportions, you're not going to get sustained combustion. I nodded along with everyone else, though I could have recited the fire triangle in my sleep. Derek continued his lecture, explaining friction methods and material selection and proper technique, building up what was clearly going to be his own demonstration before letting me attempt it. The bow drill method is probably the most reliable for beginners, though it requires quite a bit of practice to master. Most people struggle with it at first. He set up his demonstration with practiced efficiency, and I had to admit he knew what he was doing. His form was good, his material selection was appropriate, and he managed to produce a small coal within a few minutes. The group watched in fascination as he carefully transferred the coal to his tinder bundle and gently blew it into flame. "And that," he said, as the small fire crackled to life, "is how you make fire with nothing but what nature provides." The applause was genuine this time, and well-deserved. Derek had real skills, even if his delivery was insufferably condescending. He'd earned his confidence through experience, and that was something I could respect even if I didn't like him much. "Your turn, Sarah," he gestured to a similar pile of materials he had set up nearby. "Take your time, don't feel pressured. Most people don't get it on their first try." I approached the materials slowly, hyper-aware of everyone watching my every move. The wood selection was good quality, properly seasoned, with a nice variety of sizes. The tinder options included birch bark, dry grass, and some punk wood that would hold a coal well. Derek had set me up for success, assuming I had any idea what I was doing. The question was, how much competence could I show without blowing my cover completely?
I let the spindle slip out of alignment a few times, adjusted my grip awkwardly, made it look like I was struggling more than I actually was. "Good, good," Derek encouraged. "You're getting the hang of it. Remember to maintain that downward pressure." The smoke began to build, and I could smell the familiar sweet scent of wood friction. A few more strokes and I'd have a coal, but I paused, pretending to need a rest. "This is harder than it looks," I said, wiping imaginary sweat from my forehead. "You're doing great," Jenny called out. "Better than I would." Derek moved closer, ready to offer more detailed instruction. "Here, let me show you a slight adjustment to your hand position. See how if you grip it like this?" That's when we heard the footsteps coming through the forest. Heavy boots on pine needles, moving with purpose and authority. Everyone turned toward the sound, and I felt my stomach clench with sudden recognition. A figure emerged from the tree line, wearing the distinctive uniform of the National Park Service. Tall, probably mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. But it was the way he moved that caught my attention, the particular combination of awareness and confidence that I recognized immediately. Military bearing. Recent military bearing. He approached our group with a friendly smile, but I could see his eyes cataloging everything. Taking in the campsite layout, the fire setup, the group dynamics, the skill level he was observing. Professional assessment, the kind that happened automatically when you'd spent years evaluating capabilities and potential threats. "Good morning, folks," he said, his voice carrying that particular authority that comes from being the person in charge of keeping people safe in dangerous places. "I'm Ranger Martinez, just doing my regular rounds, checking on how everyone's settling in." Derek immediately straightened up, his entire demeanor shifting in the presence of real authority. "Good morning, Ranger." Derek Morrison, group leader. "We're having a great time, learning some primitive skills." Ranger Martinez nodded approvingly, but his attention had shifted to me, still kneeling beside the bow drill kit with my hands covered in wood dust and char. Something flickered in his expression, a moment of recognition that made my chest tighten. "And how's the firemaking lesson going?" he asked, though his question seemed directed specifically at me. "Oh, Sarah's just getting started. She's new to all this, so we're taking it slow, building up her confidence." But Ranger Martinez wasn't looking at Derek anymore. He was studying my face with the kind of intensity that made me want to disappear entirely. I could see the wheels turning, memory working, trying to place where he might have seen me before. And then, just as I was starting to hope he wouldn't make the connection, his expression changed completely. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of surprise and something that sounded almost like a reverence. "Major Thompson." The words hit the clearing like a thunderclap. Everything stopped. Derek's confident explanation died mid-sentence. Patricia's phone slipped in her hands. The Henderson boys looked up from their devices with sudden attention. Jenny's mouth dropped open, and I felt 15 years of carefully constructed anonymity crumble like a sandcastle hit by a wave. "I think you might have me confused with someone else," I said weakly. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was too late. Ranger Martinez was already moving toward me with purpose, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the entire campsite with unmistakable clarity. "No, ma'am, no confusion at all. Major Sarah Thompson, survival instructor, Fort Bragg. 3 tours overseas, specialized in high-risk extraction and wilderness evasion. I was Sergeant Martinez back then, did my advanced survival training under you in 2018. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Derek's face had gone through several colors, finally settling on a pale shade that matched his suddenly uncertain expression. Patricia was staring at me like I'd just revealed myself to be an alien. The Hendersons looked confused but intrigued. Jenny was processing the information with visible shock. And I was sitting there in the dirt, holding a bow drill, watching my carefully maintained cover story disappear like smoke in the wind. "Major Thompson," Ranger Martinez continued, his voice now carrying the kind of respect that made everyone else lean forward to listen. "Folks, you have no idea who you're camping with." The clearing felt like it had been suspended in time. Every sound muffled except for the gentle crackling of Derek's demonstration fire and the distant murmur of the stream. I could feel 8 pairs of eyes boring into me, waiting for some kind of explanation, some way to reconcile the bumbling city woman they'd been tolerating for 3 days with whatever Ranger Martinez was suggesting I actually was. "I think there's been a mistake," I tried again, but my voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. Martinez was looking at me with the kind of recognition that couldn't be faked, the kind that came from shared experience in places where mistakes got people killed. "No mistake, Major," Martinez said firmly, and I noticed he'd unconsciously shifted into a more formal posture. "Though I have to say, you've changed your look quite a bit since Bragg." Derek found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. "Major? As in military major?" Martinez turned to address the group, but his body language still carried that deference that made my chest tight with memories I'd spent years trying to forget. "Folks, the woman you've been teaching basic camping skills to is one of the most respected survival instructors the Army ever produced. Major Thompson didn't just teach survival techniques, she developed them." "That's impossible," Derek stammered, looking between Martinez and me like we were playing some elaborate practical joke. "She couldn't even set up her tent properly. She's been asking basic questions about everything." "Basic questions are how smart people learn," Martinez replied, and there was an edge to his voice that made Derek take a step back. Though I suspect the Major was doing more observing than learning. Jenny was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Hurt, maybe, that I hadn't told her. Confusion about why I'd let Derek treat me like an incompetent novice. "Sarah, is this true?" I looked around at their faces, at the expectations and assumptions that had defined our entire trip, and felt something inside me finally give way. Not anger exactly, but a kind of tired resignation. The secret was out, and there was no putting it back. "It's true," I said quietly, setting down the bow drill and standing up slowly. "Though it was a long time ago." "Not that long," Martinez said with what might have been the beginning of a smile.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us.
Now back to the story. The techniques you developed for cold weather survival are still being taught. Your water procurement protocols saved my squad's ass in Afghanistan, if you'll pardon the language. Patricia had been recording everything with her phone, but now she lowered it slowly, her expression shifting from entertainment to something approaching awe. "You're actually military?" "Was," I corrected. "Retired. 15 years ago." "Retired as a major," Martinez emphasized, "after 3 combat deployments and more successful search and rescue operations than anyone I know. The woman who wrote the manual on wilderness evasion techniques that half the Special Forces units still use today." Derek's face had gone through several more color changes, settling somewhere between embarrassment and disbelief. "But you couldn't start a fire. You've been struggling with basic camp setup all weekend." "Have I?" I asked, and for the first time since arriving at Pine Ridge, I let my real voice show through. Not the uncertain, apologetic tone I'd been using, but the voice that had given briefings to colonels and coordinated rescue operations in hostile territory. The change was immediate and obvious. Everyone could hear it. The shift from hesitant amateur to confident professional. It was like watching someone drop a mask they'd been wearing so long you'd forgotten what their real face looked like. "You set up camp in the most defensible position available," I continued, gesturing toward our site. "High ground, clear sight lines, multiple escape routes, protected water source. Your gear selection is appropriate but expensive, suggesting you learned from guidebooks rather than experience. Your fire-building technique is competent but inefficient, probably learned from YouTube videos or weekend workshops." Derek's mouth opened and closed without sound. "You've made 17 distinct comments about wilderness safety and survival priorities, and 12 of them contained minor but potentially dangerous inaccuracies. Your navigation skills are adequate for marked trails but would fail completely in actual emergency conditions. And your leadership style creates dangerous dependency rather than building individual competence." The silence that followed my assessment was different from before. Not uncomfortable confusion, but the kind of quiet that happens when people suddenly realize they're in the presence of expertise they hadn't recognized. Martinez was nodding slowly. "There's the major, I remember. Always direct, always accurate, never unnecessarily harsh, but never sugarcoating the truth either." "I wasn't trying to be harsh," I said, looking at Derek with something that might have been sympathy. "You've got good intentions and decent basic skills, but leading people in the wilderness requires more than enthusiasm and expensive gear." "How much more?" asked Mark Henderson, speaking up for the first time since the revelation began. He was looking at me with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism, like he was trying to understand what he was actually dealing with. "More than you want to know," I replied honestly. "More than most people need to know, unless they're planning to spend time in places where GPS doesn't work and rescue teams can't reach you." Martinez laughed, a sound that carried years of shared understanding. "The major is being modest. Sarah, you want to tell them about Operation Frozen Creek?" "No," I said immediately. "I don't." "Come on," Martinez urged. "It's not classified anymore. Hell, it's practically a legend at this point." "What's Operation Frozen Creek?" Emma asked from where she'd been sitting quietly with her parents, probably the only person in the group who wasn't struggling to reconcile my old identity with my new one. Martinez looked at me expectantly, and I could see he wasn't going to let this go. The story was going to come out one way or another, and I'd rather control how it was told rather than let it get garbled through someone else's recollection. "It was a search and rescue operation," I said reluctantly. "Winter conditions in the Rockies. A civilian hiking group got caught in an unexpected storm, lost contact for 4 days. Worst blizzard Colorado had seen in 20 years, Martinez added. Temperatures dropped to -30, wind gusts over 60 miles per hour. Search teams couldn't get helicopters in the air, couldn't get vehicles within 10 miles of the search area." Jenny was listening with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for her daughter's school presentations. "What happened?"
Standard protocol would have been to wait for conditions to improve, but by the time the storm cleared, exposure casualties would have been inevitable. So they sent in a ground team. They sent in the major, Martinez corrected. Solo insertion, 72-hour window, coordinates based on their last known position before communication was lost. Derek was staring at me like I'd just claimed to be able to fly. Solo? In a blizzard? That's insane. It was necessary, I replied simply. 5 civilians, including 2 children, were going to die if someone didn't reach them. The risk assessment favored action over inaction. Tell them how you found them, Martinez prompted. I really didn't want to relive this story, but everyone was listening with the kind of attention that made it clear they weren't going to let me deflect. Even the Henderson boys had put away their phones and were hanging on every word. The coordinates were wrong. The storm had disoriented them, and they'd wandered nearly 3 miles from their intended route. Their emergency beacon was damaged, so electronic tracking wasn't reliable. So how did you locate them? Old-fashioned tracking, reading the terrain, understanding how people move when they're lost and scared, looking for signs that most searchers would miss. Like what? Emma wanted to know. I smiled at her, the first genuine smile I'd felt since Martinez had blown my cover. Broken branches at unusual heights, suggesting someone had grabbed them for support. Scuff marks on rocks that indicated tired, unsteady movement. Fabric threads caught on thorns that matched the clothing descriptions in the missing persons report. You followed a trail that was 3 days old, in a blizzard, Martinez said, and his voice carried a note of admiration that made me uncomfortable. In whiteout conditions where most people couldn't see their own feet. The storm helped, actually. It preserved sign that would have been degraded under normal conditions.
And people leave more obvious traces when they're struggling. Patricia was recording again, but discreetly now, like she understood she was documenting something important rather than entertaining. How long did it take you to find them? 18 hours from insertion to contact. They'd taken shelter in a small cave system about 8 miles from the search zone perimeter. Smart thinking, actually. The father had kept them together, rationed their supplies, maintained body heat through group positioning. They did everything right except stay put. Were they okay? Jenny asked. 2 cases of mild hypothermia, some dehydration, various minor injuries from the initial fall that had gotten them lost in the first place, but alive, conscious, and able to assist with their own extraction. Extraction was the real challenge, Martinez added. Getting 6 people back to safety through terrain that had already challenged an expert? I could see Derek struggling with something, probably trying to reconcile this story with the woman who'd been fumbling with tent stakes 3 days ago. How do you extract 6 people from a cave in the middle of a blizzard? Very carefully, I said calmly, and with a lot of help from people who knew what they were doing. The major rappelled down a 60-foot cliff face in 0 visibility to reach the cave entrance, Martinez said, clearly enjoying the effect his words were having on the group, then spent 6 hours rigging a pulley system to get everyone back up to safe ground. The cliff wasn't 60 feet, I protested automatically, more like 40, and I had proper equipment. In a storm where the wind chill was registering minus 50 degrees, Martinez continued relentlessly, using gear that kept freezing every time she stopped moving. Linda Henderson was shaking her head slowly. That's like something out of a movie. It was just a job, I said firmly. A job that needed doing, with people who were trained to do it. Bullshit, Martinez said cheerfully. Sorry, folks, but that's complete bullshit. I've worked with search and rescue teams all over the country, and what the major did that day was extraordinary by any standard. The technique she used to navigate in 0 visibility became standard protocol for mountain rescue operations. What technique? Asked Mark, leaning forward with genuine professional interest. I sighed, recognizing that Martinez wasn't going to let me minimize this story. Sound navigation, using echo patterns and wind direction to maintain bearing when visual reference points aren't available. It's not complicated, just requires practice and patience. Practice and patience, Martinez repeated with a laugh. Right, like saying brain surgery just requires practice and patience. It's not that mysterious, I insisted. You map the acoustic environment the same way you'd map visual terrain. Learn to read how sound bounces off different surfaces,
how wind patterns change around obstacles, how your own movement affects what you can hear. Derek was looking at me like I was speaking a foreign language. You navigate by sound? Among other things. Smell, temperature gradients, ground texture, even subtle changes in atmospheric pressure. When you can't see where you're going, you use everything else. That's incredible, Emma said with the kind of awe that only 8-year-olds can manage, like having superpowers. Not superpowers, I corrected gently. Just training. Anyone can learn these techniques if they practice enough. Anyone can learn the basics, Martinez said, but not everyone can apply them under pressure, in life or death situations, when everything is going wrong and people are depending on you to have the right answers. He was looking at me with an expression that made me want to change the subject immediately. There was too much weight in that look, too much history and respect and expectation. That was a long time ago, I said quietly. Different life, different responsibilities. Different uniform, Martinez agreed, but not different person. Skills like that don't just disappear, Major. They're part of who you are. Former Major, I corrected automatically. Once a Major, always a Major, at least in my book. The group had fallen silent again, but this time the quiet felt thoughtful rather than awkward. Everyone was processing what they'd learned, trying to fit this new information into their understanding of the person they'd been camping with for 3 days. Jenny was the first to speak. Why didn't you tell us about your background, your experience? It was a fair question, and one I'd been dreading since Martinez had first called my name. How do you explain that sometimes the weight of being competent gets too heavy to carry, that sometimes you just want to be normal, unremarkable, allowed to struggle with tent stakes without everyone expecting you to have all the answers? Because I wanted to be your sister, not your survival instructor. I wanted to go camping with my family and not be responsible for everyone's safety. I wanted to ask stupid questions and make beginner mistakes and just be a regular person for a weekend. But you are responsible for everyone's safety, Derek said, and there was something in his voice that might have been the beginning of understanding. Whether you want to be or not, whether we know it or not. He was right, and we both knew it. The moment something had gone wrong, the moment anyone in this group had been in real danger, I would have dropped the act and done whatever was necessary to keep them safe. Competence isn't something you can turn off when it's inconvenient. That's the burden of expertise, Martinez said softly. Once you know how to save lives, you can't unknow it. Once you've been responsible for other people's survival, that responsibility becomes part of you. Which is exactly why I retired, I replied more sharply than I'd intended, because carrying that responsibility for 15 years was enough. Martinez held up his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm not criticizing, Major. Hell, you earned the right to retire however you want.
I'm just saying that skills like yours don't disappear just because you stopped using them professionally. Patricia had been quiet through most of this exchange, but now she spoke up with obvious curiosity. What made you retire, if you were so good at it, I mean? It was another fair question, and another one I'd been hoping to avoid. The real answer was complicated, involving bureaucracy and politics and the kind of mission creep that turns rescue operations into something darker. But there was a simpler answer that was also true. Burnout, I said simply. 15 years of being responsible for life and death decisions in impossible situations. You reach a point where you've seen enough, done enough, lost enough people despite your best efforts. You realize you want to have a life where the biggest crisis is running out of coffee. But you chose finance, Mike pointed out with a slight smile. Different kind of crisis management. I laughed despite myself. Numbers don't die when you make mistakes. Bad quarterly reports don't leave families without fathers. Market analysis failures don't result in body bags. The stark honesty of that statement seemed to settle over the group like a blanket. Everyone was quiet for a moment, processing the reality of what my previous life had actually involved. So you really have been struggling with the camping stuff, Derek asked, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than condescension. Some of it, I admitted. It's been 15 years since I've done this recreationally, and there's a difference between survival skills and camping comfort.
I know how to start a fire with a broken shoelace and some pine sap, but I haven't practiced setting up modern recreational tents. I can navigate by stars and terrain features, but I'm out of practice with consumer GPS units. Plus, Martinez added with obvious amusement, the Major was probably observing everyone else's technique before deciding whether to blow her cover by demonstrating superior skills. He was more right than I wanted to admit. Part of my struggle had been genuine rustiness, but part of it had been deliberate assessment. Watching how Derek led the group, evaluating the skill levels of the other adults, noting potential hazards and escape routes, cataloging resources and capabilities, old habits from a life where situational awareness meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "You've been evaluating us," Derek said, and it wasn't a question. "Constantly," I confirmed. "It's automatic at this point. Group dynamics, individual capabilities, environmental hazards, contingency planning. I can't turn it off." "And what's your assessment?" Mark asked with what sounded like genuine professional interest. I looked around at their faces, weighing how much honesty they could handle. These were good people, well-intentioned, and reasonably prepared for the kind of recreational camping they had planned, but they weren't prepared for real wilderness emergencies, and several of Derek's decisions over the past few days had created unnecessary risks. "You want the professional assessment or the polite camping assessment?" I asked. "Professional," Derek said immediately, and I could see him bracing himself for criticism. "You've created dangerous dependency relationships," I said directly. "Everyone defers to Derek for decisions that each person should be capable of making independently. Your camp organization prioritizes comfort over security. Your route planning assumes continuous access to marked trails and established campsites. And your emergency protocols are limited to cell phone communication and hoping for quick rescue response." Derek's face had gone slightly pale. "What would you do differently?" "Cross-training," I said immediately. "Everyone should know everyone else's essential skills. Redundant communication methods that don't depend on cell towers, emergency supply caches hidden along your planned routes, alternative evacuation plans that assume you can't retrace your steps, and individual competency development so that losing any one person doesn't cripple the group's survival capacity." "Jesus," whispered Linda Henderson, "you really do think like a military person." "I think like someone who's seen what happens when people aren't prepared for things to go wrong," I corrected. "Because in my experience, things go wrong more often than people expect." Martinez was nodding slowly. "That's the difference between recreational outdoors activities and actual wilderness survival. Recreation assumes that help is available if you need it. Survival assumes that you're on your own." "So, which situation are we in now?" Emma asked with the kind of direct logic that only children manage. Everyone looked around the campsite, suddenly aware that we were sitting in actual wilderness, miles from cell towers and quick rescue response, with limited supplies and mixed competency levels. The comfortable fiction of recreational camping suddenly felt a lot less comfortable. "We're probably fine," I said carefully. "This is an established campground with regular ranger patrols and well-marked trails back to civilization. But if something unexpected happened, if someone got seriously injured or we encountered severe weather, our margin for error is smaller than most people realize." "How much smaller?" Jenny asked, and I could hear the worry creeping into her voice. I looked at Martinez, who understood the question and its implications. "Major, you want to field this one?" "In ideal conditions, with everyone healthy and weather cooperating, we're maybe 6 hours from vehicle access. But if someone breaks a leg or we get caught in a serious storm, that timeline extends significantly. And if multiple problems compound, which they have a tendency to do, we could be looking at days rather than hours." "Days?" Patricia repeated, her voice climbing toward panic. "Unlikely," I said quickly, "but possible. Which is why competent wilderness travel requires planning for unlikely scenarios." Derek was staring at the ground, probably recalculating every decision he had made over the past 3 days. "I had no idea we were taking those kinds of risks." "You weren't," Martinez said firmly. "Not with the Major here. Whether she wanted the responsibility or not, her presence changes the risk equation completely."
And there it was, the weight I had been trying to avoid for 15 years, settling back onto my shoulders like an old pack that still fit perfectly. The expectation that I would know what to do, that I would have the answers, that I would be responsible for keeping everyone safe. I could see it in their faces now, the subtle shift from treating me as an equal to looking at me as an authority figure, the questions they wanted to ask, the confidence they wanted to draw from my presence, the responsibility they wanted to transfer to my more capable hand.
It was exactly what I'd been trying to escape, and exactly what I'd known was inevitable from the moment Martinez had said my name. "Well," I said, with a sigh that came from somewhere deep in my chest, "I guess the cat's out of the bag now." The afternoon passed differently than any other time since we'd arrived at Pine Ridge. The easy camaraderie of the first few days was gone, replaced by something more complex and harder to navigate. People kept glancing at me when they thought I wasn't looking, like they were trying to reconcile the woman who'd struggled with tent stakes with the person Martinez had described. Conversations would start and then falter when I approached, not from rudeness, but from uncertainty about how to act around me now. Derek had been especially quiet, alternating between studying me with newfound respect and staring off into the forest with what looked like deep embarrassment. He'd spent the past 3 days positioning himself as the group's wilderness expert, and now everyone knew that the person he'd been condescending to could probably navigate blindfolded through terrain that would leave him hopelessly lost. I tried to return to our normal routine, helping with camp chores and staying out of the way, but even that felt different now. When I offered to help Patricia with dinner preparation, she insisted on asking my opinion about everything from water purification to food storage. When Mark Henderson's youngest son scraped his knee on a sharp rock, 3 adults immediately turned to me instead of reaching for the first aid kit they'd been using all weekend. The weight of expectation was settling back onto my shoulders with familiar heaviness, and I could feel the careful anonymity I'd built over 15 years crumbling with each passing hour. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. Exactly why I'd let Derek mock my outdoor skills instead of demonstrating what I actually knew. Martinez had stayed longer than his usual patrol rounds warranted, clearly enjoying watching the group dynamics shift in real time. He was sitting by Derek's rebuilt fire, regaling anyone who would listen with stories about military survival training and the techniques that had been developed at Fort Bragg during my tenure there. "The thing people don't understand about survival psychology," he was saying to Mike and Mark, "is that knowledge is only half the equation. Mental resilience, the ability to make rational decisions under extreme stress, that's what separates people who survive from people who don't." "And Major Thompson was good at the psychological aspects too?" Mike asked. "The best I ever worked with," Martinez replied without hesitation. She had this way of staying calm in situations that would panic most people. I've seen her coordinate rescue operations while hanging from a cliff face in a lightning storm, making split-second decisions that kept everyone alive. I wished he would stop. Every story he told just reinforced the image of competence and authority that I'd been trying to escape. But I could see that the others were fascinated, hungry for details about a world they'd never experienced and a level of expertise they'd never encountered. Jenny approached me while I was reorganizing my pack, something I'd been doing more from nervous energy than necessity. She sat down on the picnic table bench beside me, close enough for private conversation, but not so close as to seem confrontational. "I feel like I don't know you at all," she said quietly. "You know me," I replied, not looking up from my unnecessarily neat equipment arrangement. "You know me, better than anyone else here. The military stuff, that was work. This is who I am now." "But you've been lying to us for 3 days, letting Derek treat you like you didn't know anything, pretending to be helpless with basic camping skills." "I wasn't lying," I said, though the distinction felt thin even to me. "I was just not volunteering information that wasn't relevant to our trip." Jenny was quiet for a moment, watching me fold and refold a fleece jacket that was already perfectly organized. "Is that why you never talk about what you did before Chicago? Why you always change the subject when anyone asks about your military service?" The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit.
For 15 years, I'd deflected questions about my past with practiced ease, building a wall between my current life and everything that came before. It wasn't shame, exactly, but something more complicated. A desire to be seen as a normal person, rather than as a collection of extraordinary experiences and capabilities. Because once people know what you used to do, that's all they see. They stop seeing you as a regular person and start seeing you as a resource, someone who should have all the answers, who should be responsible for solving problems that aren't yours to solve. Like what's happening right now? I looked around the campsite, where Patricia was asking Martinez detailed questions about wilderness first aid, while Derek sat silently nearby, clearly struggling with his diminished role as group leader. The Henderson boys had abandoned their phones entirely and were hanging on Martinez's every word as he described advanced navigation techniques. As if summoned by our conversation, Derek approached us with the kind of determined expression that suggested he'd been working up the courage for this conversation for hours. "Sarah," he began, then stopped and corrected himself. "Major Thompson, I owe you an apology." "I don't owe you anything," I said automatically. "And it's just Sarah." "No, I do," he insisted. "I've been treating you like an incompetent amateur all weekend, making assumptions about your capabilities based on your appearance and background. That was wrong, and it was unprofessional." His apology was sincere, but it carried undertones that made me uncomfortable. There was deference in his voice now, the kind of automatic respect that people showed when they suddenly realized they were dealing with someone whose expertise far exceeded their own. "Derek, you didn't know," I said, trying to diffuse the moment. "You were working with the information you had, and you were trying to keep everyone safe. Your intentions were good." "But my methods were terrible," he replied with brutal honesty. "I was showing off for my own ego instead of focusing on what was actually best for the group." Before I could respond, Martinez's radio crackled to life with the distinctive static and urgent tone that every emergency responder recognizes. Immediately, the casual conversation around the fire stopped as everyone turned toward the sound. "Ranger Martinez, we have a situation developing in Sector 7. Missing hiker, separated from their group approximately 4 hours ago. Last known position was the Eastern Ridge Trail System." Martinez keyed his radio immediately. "Copy that. Dispatch, do we have description and equipment status on the missing person?" "Affirmative. Female, approximately 25 years old, wearing red jacket and black hiking pants. Equipped with pay pack but no overnight gear. Weather service is showing incoming storm system. Temperature drop expected after nightfall." I felt my stomach tighten. 4 hours was right at the edge of the window where a missing hiker case could shift from routine to critical, especially with weather moving in. Without proper gear, exposure would become a serious threat once the temperature dropped. "Copy," Martinez replied. "I'm en route to coordinate search operations. Estimated arrival at staging area, 15 minutes.
He stood up quickly, already shifting into professional mode. His casual demeanor was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of someone coordinating an emergency response. But as he started toward his vehicle, he stopped and looked back at our group with an expression I recognized. He was looking at me. "Major," he said quietly, "I don't suppose you'd consider lending some expertise to this situation?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Everyone was watching me, waiting to see how I would respond. Jenny looked worried, probably recognizing that I was being asked to step back into a world I'd left behind. Derek was watching with obvious curiosity, perhaps wondering if he was about to see the legendary survival expert in action. "What kind of terrain are we talking about?" I asked, though part of me already knew I was going to say yes. The moment Martinez had mentioned an incoming storm and insufficient gear, the decision had made itself. "Eastern Ridge System is rough country," Martinez replied, pulling out a topographic map and spreading it on the picnic table. "Steep terrain, limited trail access, multiple ravines and creek crossings. Dense forest cover that makes aerial searches difficult." I studied the map, recognizing the area from our approach to the campground. It was challenging terrain even in good conditions, with plenty of places where an inexperienced hiker could get lost or injured. With a storm coming in, it would become genuinely dangerous. "How many searchers do you have available?" I asked.
2 other rangers, possibly a volunteer SAR team if we can get them mobilized quickly enough. But that's a big area to cover with limited personnel. I could see the problem immediately. Standard search patterns would take too long to cover the potential search area, especially with deteriorating weather conditions. What they needed was someone who could read the terrain and predict where a lost hiker would most likely go. Someone who could eliminate vast areas of low-probability terrain and focus the search on high-yield locations. What they needed was exactly the kind of skills I'd spent 15 years developing and trying to forget. "How experienced is the missing hiker?" I asked. "Unknown," Martinez replied. "She was part of a day hiking group from a youth outdoors program, mixed experience levels, some beginners." That narrowed things down considerably. An inexperienced hiker would follow predictable patterns when lost, making choices based on panic and fatigue rather than strategic thinking. They would seek immediate shelter rather than optimal positioning, follow water sources even when they led away from rescue, and generally move in ways that could be anticipated if you understood the psychology of being lost and afraid. "I'll help," I said simply. The reaction was immediate. Jenny grabbed my arm with obvious concern. "Sarah, you said you were retired. You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," I replied, and the certainty in my voice surprised even me. "There's someone out there who's scared and cold and probably making decisions that are going to get her into serious trouble. If I can help find her before the storm hits, I have to try." Derek was staring at me with an expression that might have been awe. "What do you need us to do?" "Stay here, keep the campsite secure, and don't do anything unnecessarily risky," I said automatically, my mind already shifting into operational mode. "If we're not back by morning, contact the ranger station and let them know what happened." Martinez was already gathering his gear, but he paused to look at the rest of the group. "Folks, you're about to see why the Major has the reputation she does. This is what real wilderness expertise looks like." I ignored the compliment and focused on the practical considerations. "Martinez, what kind of communication equipment do you have? GPS capabilities? Emergency medical supplies?" "Standard Ranger kit," he replied, patting his radio and equipment belt, "plus vehicle-mounted communication system and basic first aid." "Good. We'll want to establish regular check-in intervals with dispatch, and we'll need to coordinate with any other search teams to avoid duplication of effort." I was already moving toward my pack, pulling out gear I hadn't expected to use on this trip. Emergency shelter materials, high-energy food supplies, water purification tablets, and a compact first aid kit that was far more comprehensive than anything a recreational camper would normally carry. "Sarah," Jenny called as I shouldered my pack, "be careful out there." I turned back to look at her, at all of them watching me with expressions ranging from concern to fascination. These people had spent 3 days thinking I was a bumbling amateur, and now they were watching me transform into someone they'd never seen before. "I will," I promised. "And when we get back, we'll talk about why I really didn't want anyone to know about this stuff." The transition from campsite to search operation took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like stepping through a doorway into a different world. The casual weekend camping atmosphere was gone, replaced by the focused urgency of an emergency response. Martinez had shifted completely into professional mode, coordinating with dispatch and updating incoming search teams about our planned approach. "Search strategy?" he asked as we hiked quickly toward the trailhead that would take us into the Eastern Ridge area. "Pattern recognition and probability mapping," I replied, studying the topographic features as we moved. "We eliminate low-probability areas first, then focus on the most likely locations based on hiker psychology and terrain analysis." Hiker psychology? Predictable behavior patterns when people are lost and panicked. They follow water sources even when they lead away from rescue. They seek immediate shelter rather than strategic positioning. They make emotional decisions rather than logical ones. We reached the main trailhead in good time, where Martinez's vehicle was equipped with more detailed maps and communication equipment. I spread the topographic charts across the hood of his truck, using a red pen to mark key terrain features and potential search zones. "She was last seen here," Martinez said, pointing to a marked location on the Eastern Ridge Trail. "Group was taking a lunch break. She went to explore some rock formations and never came back." I studied the terrain around the marked location, noting elevation changes, water sources, and natural terrain funnels that would influence movement patterns. "How long between when she left the group and when they realized she was missing?" "About an hour. They spent another hour searching the immediate area before hiking out to report it." That timeline was both good and bad. Good because it limited the potential search area based on how far someone could travel in that time frame.
Bad because it meant she'd been missing for over 4 hours now, with darkness and weather closing in. "She's probably following Cascade Creek," I said, tracing a blue line on the map with my finger. "It's the most obvious landmark from the point where she separated from her group, and people instinctively follow water when they're lost." "But the creek leads away from the main trail system." "Exactly, which means she's getting further from rescue with every hour that passes."
I studied the creek's path through the terrain, noting where it intersected with other natural features. "Here," I said, marking location about 2 miles downstream from the separation point. "There's a natural shelter area where the creek bends around this rock formation. If she's thinking about staying put until rescue arrives, that's where she'd go. And if she's not thinking about staying put?" I traced the creek further downstream, where it eventually intersected with a more substantial trail system. She might try to follow the water all the way down to this secondary trail, thinking it would lead back to civilization. But that's another 3 miles through increasingly difficult terrain. Martinez keyed his radio to update dispatch with our planned search route. While he coordinated with the other response teams, I studied the weather forecast and made calculations about how much time we had before conditions became genuinely hazardous. "Storm's moving in faster than originally predicted," Martinez said when he finished his radio conversation. "We've got maybe 3 hours of decent weather before things get ugly." 3 hours to search approximately 5 miles of rough terrain for someone who could be anywhere along that route, assuming my analysis was correct? It was tight timing, but workable if we moved efficiently and didn't waste time on low-probability areas. "Let's go," I said, shouldering my pack and checking that all my essential gear was easily accessible. The hike into the search area reminded me why I'd loved this work, despite its dangers and difficulties. There was something pure about moving through wilderness with a clear mission, using skills that had been developed through years of training and experience. Every step had purpose. Every decision mattered, and there was no room for doubt or hesitation. Martinez was a competent hiking partner, matching my pace and staying quiet when concentration was required. I could see him watching me work, noting how I read the terrain and looked for signs that most people would miss. Broken vegetation, disturbed soil, fabric threads caught on thorns, all the tiny indicators that someone had passed this way recently. "There," I said, stopping beside a large boulder about a mile into our search route. "She definitely came this way." Martinez looked where I was pointing, but didn't immediately see what I was seeing. "What am I looking for?" "Scuff mark on that rock face, about shoulder height. Too high to be from wildlife, wrong pattern for normal trail wear. Someone grabbed that rock for support, probably someone who was tired and not moving confidently." He studied the mark I'd indicated, then nodded slowly. "How can you tell it's recent?" "Color of the exposed rock underneath. If that mark was more than a few hours old, weathering would have already started to dull the contrast." We continued downstream, following the creek and finding increasingly clear evidence that someone had passed this way recently. Footprints in soft soil, broken branches at head height, and eventually a clear boot print in a muddy area beside the water. "Female hiking boot, size 7 or 8, I noted, photographing the print with Martinez's camera for documentation. "Tread pattern suggests light hiking rather than serious backpacking gear." "How do you know all this?" Martinez asked, as we continued following the trail. "The same way you know the difference between a tourist and a serious hiker just by looking at their gear. Pattern recognition, experience, and paying attention to details that most people overlook." The trail we were following became increasingly clear as we moved deeper into the search area. Our missing hiker was definitely following the creek, and she was moving steadily downstream rather than stopping to wait for rescue. That was both good and bad news. Good because it meant she was mobile and making rational decisions about movement. Bad because she was getting further from the main trail system with every hour. "Major," Martinez said as we paused to check our position against the map, "I have to ask, how did you get so good at this? I mean, I know you had military training, but this level of skill seems like something else entirely." It was a fair question, and one that required a more complicated answer than I usually gave. Natural aptitude, extensive training, and way too much practical experience in situations where getting it wrong meant people died. "What kind of situations?" I looked ahead toward the terrain we still needed to cover, calculating distances and timing against the approaching weather. The kind that don't make it into official reports. The kind where small teams get sent into places that don't exist to solve problems that never happened. Martinez was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I just told him. Special operations? Adjacent, I said carefully. Search and rescue, personnel recovery, extraction operations in hostile environments. When conventional SAR teams couldn't operate, when political considerations required off-the-books solutions, when the mission parameters were too sensitive for regular channels. Jesus, he said softly. No wonder you were good at it. We found her about an hour later, exactly where I'd predicted she would be. The natural shelter area formed by the creek bend and rock formation provided protection from wind and a reliable water source, and she'd had the intelligence to stop moving and wait for rescue rather than continuing to wander deeper into the wilderness. Thank God, she said when she saw us approaching. I was starting to think no one was coming. We've been tracking you for the past hour, I told her, as Martinez radioed our position to dispatch. You did exactly the right thing by staying here and waiting for help. The extraction took another hour, hiking back upstream to the main trail system where Martinez's vehicle was waiting. Jessica was tired but mobile, and we maintained a steady pace that got us back to safety well before the storm hit. By the time we returned to the Pine Ridge Campground, it was full dark and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. The group was waiting anxiously by the fire, and the relief on their faces when they saw us approaching was obvious from a distance. Is she okay? Jenny called as soon as we were within earshot. Cold and tired, but fine. Martinez is taking her to the ranger station for medical evaluation and reunification with her group. Derek stood up as I approached the fire, and there was something different in his expression. Not the defensive embarrassment I'd seen earlier, but genuine respect and admiration. That was incredible to watch, he said simply. The way you read the terrain, followed the trail signs, and predicted exactly where she would be. I've never seen anything like it. It's just training and experience, I said automatically, though I was surprised to realize how good it had felt to use those skills again. Anyone could learn to do it. Bullshit, Martinez said cheerfully, as he prepared to leave with Jessica. Sorry, folks, but that's complete bullshit. I've worked with search and rescue teams all over the country, and what the Major did tonight was textbook perfect. She cut 4 hours off what should have been an all-night search operation. As Martinez drove away with Jessica safely in his vehicle, I sat down heavily on one of the picnic table benches. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me tired but oddly satisfied. For the first time in 15 years, I'd used my skills for their original purpose, finding someone who was lost and bringing them home safely.
So, Patricia said quietly, this is what you used to do every day? Not every day, I replied, but often enough. And you gave it up to work in finance? I looked around at their faces, at the firelight and the forest, and the safe little bubble of civilization we'd created in the wilderness. I gave it up because I wanted a life where success was measured in quarterly reports rather than body counts, where the worst thing that could happen was losing money rather than losing people. But you're clearly still good at it, Mark Henderson observed, and you obviously still care about helping people. Caring was never the problem, I said softly. The problem was carrying the weight of responsibility for other people's lives every single day for 15 years. The problem was knowing that every decision I made could mean the difference between someone going home to their family or not. Jenny sat down beside me, close enough for sisterly comfort. And tonight? I thought about Jessica, scared and cold, but alive, now safely reunited with her group because someone had been able to find her before the storm hit. I thought about Martinez's radio crackling with emergency calls, about search patterns and terrain analysis, and all the skills I'd tried so hard to leave behind. Tonight felt different, I admitted. Tonight felt like maybe I'd been hiding from something I was supposed to be doing. The group was quiet for a while, watching the fire and listening to the first gentle drops of rain on the canvas shelter Derek had rigged over our seating area. The storm Martinez had warned about was beginning in earnest, but we were safe and dry and together.
"What happens now?" Derek asked eventually. I looked at him, this man who'd spent 3 days trying to prove his wilderness competence to a group that included someone whose expertise far exceeded his own. But there was no resentment in his question, no wounded pride, just genuine curiosity about what came next. "Now we finish our camping trip," I said simply. "We enjoy the rest of our weekend, we tell stories around the fire, and we go home with some interesting memories." "And after that?" I considered the question seriously. For 15 years, I'd built a life that was safe and predictable and completely separate from everything I'd been before. But tonight had reminded me that some skills are too valuable to waste, that some responsibilities are too important to abandon permanently. "After that, I think I might make some phone calls," I said finally. "See if there are ways to use what I know without carrying the weight I used to carry. Maybe volunteer with local search and rescue teams, teach wilderness survival courses, consult on emergency preparedness planning." "Part-time hero instead of full-time?" Jenny suggested with a smile. "Something like that," I agreed. "Someone who can help when help is needed, but who doesn't have to carry the world on her shoulders every day." The rain was falling steadily now, drumming on our shelter and filling the forest with the sound of water on leaves. But we were warm and dry and safe, sitting around a fire with people who had learned to see me as something more than they'd originally thought. "You know what's funny?" Derek said into the comfortable silence. "What's that?" 3 days ago, I thought I was the one who was going to keep everyone safe out here. I thought my outdoor experience and leadership skills were what this group needed to have a successful trip. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling up into the darkness. Turns out, the person I really needed to learn from was the one I'd been treating like a beginner. That's the thing about real expertise. It doesn't usually announce itself. It just quietly does what needs to be done. "Is that why you never corrected me when I was giving you advice about things you probably knew better than I did?" I considered how to answer that honestly. Partly because I was enjoying not being the expert for once, but mostly because you meant well, and there's always something to learn from someone else's perspective, even if you already know the subject. "Even when they're wrong?" "Especially when they're wrong," I said with a slight smile. "Wrong answers often teach you more than right ones, because they force you to think about why they're wrong and what the right approach should be." Patricia had been quiet through most of this conversation, but now she spoke up with obvious curiosity. "So all those times you asked basic questions, you already knew the answers?" "Some of them," I admitted, "but not all. It's been 15 years since I did this regularly, and some things have changed. Equipment has improved, techniques have evolved, and there's always more to learn. Plus," I added, "there's a difference between knowing something theoretically and knowing it practically. I might remember the principles of modern tent design, but I haven't set up a recreational tent in 15 years. The muscle memory was rusty." "But the important stuff," Martinez had said before leaving with Jessica, "the stuff that really matters when lives are on the line, that's like riding a bicycle. You never really forget." He'd been right about that. When the radio had crackled with news of a missing hiker, when there had been real need for the skills I'd spent decades developing, everything had come back with startling clarity. The terrain analysis, the behavioral prediction, the systematic approach to complex problem-solving under pressure, all of it had felt as natural as breathing. "So what's the lesson here?" Emma asked with the directness that only children manage. "What are we supposed to learn from all this?" It was a good question, and one that deserved a thoughtful answer. I looked around at the group, at Derek, who was learning that real leadership meant recognizing expertise wherever it came from, at Patricia and Linda, who were discovering that assumptions about people could be dangerously wrong, at Mike and Mark, who were processing what it meant to be in the presence of capabilities they'd never imagined. Maybe that we all contain more than what shows on the surface. Maybe that real competence doesn't need to prove itself until it's actually needed. And maybe that the most important people in any situation aren't always the ones who are obviously in charge. Like having a wilderness survival expert disguised as someone who can't figure out tent stakes, Jenny suggested. Or like having someone who thinks they know everything discover they have a lot left to learn, Derek added quietly. The fire was burning low, and the rain was settling into the steady rhythm that suggested it would continue through the night. Tomorrow, we would pack up our camp and return to civilization, back to our regular lives and normal responsibilities. But something had changed in the dynamic between us, something that would carry forward into whatever relationships we maintain after this weekend. I'm glad Martinez recognized you, not just because it helped save that girl tonight, but because it reminded all of us that expertise comes in unexpected packages, and that real leaders are the ones who recognize expertise and defer to it when it matters, I replied, meeting his eyes across the dying fire. We said our goodnights and retreated to our respective shelters, listening to the rain on canvas and the distant sound of the creek that had led us to Jessica. I lay awake for a while, thinking about the day's events and what they meant for the carefully constructed life I'd built in Chicago. For 15 years, I'd hidden who I used to be, buried my capabilities under layers of civilian normalcy and corporate responsibility. I'd convinced myself that I was done with emergency response, done with life and death decisions, done with carrying the weight of other people's survival. But tonight had reminded me that some responsibilities aren't burdens to be escaped, but purposes to be embraced.
Some skills are too valuable to waste, some knowledge too important to keep hidden, some capabilities too needed to remain unused. Tomorrow I would go back to Chicago, back to my office and my quarterly reports and my predictable life. But I would also start making phone calls, reaching out to organizations that could use someone with my background and experience. Not full-time, not with the crushing weight of constant responsibility I'd carried before, but as someone who could help when help was truly needed. Because tonight had taught me that you can run from who you used to be, but you can't run from who you really are. And who I really was, underneath 15 years of careful camouflage, was someone who found lost people and brought them home safely. The rain continued through the night, washing the forest clean and filling the streams with fresh water. And somewhere in that sound I found a peace I hadn't felt in 15 years. The peace of knowing that my skills still mattered, that my experience still had value, and that there would always be people who needed finding, even if they didn't know they were lost yet. 6 months later, I stood in the same Pine Ridge parking lot, watching Derek unload gear from his truck with considerably more humility than he'd shown the previous year. The annual family camping trip had become a tradition, but everything about it was different now. "Sarah, could you check my pack configuration?" Derek asked, holding up his backpack with genuine deference. "I want to make sure I've got the weight distribution right." I examined his setup, noting the improvements he'd made in gear selection and organization. "Much better. You've learned a lot since last year." "I had a good teacher," he replied with a smile that held no trace of his former condescension. The group dynamic had shifted fundamentally after that weekend. Derek had enrolled in wilderness first aid courses and spent months learning proper leadership techniques that built group competence rather than dependency. Patricia had become fascinated with outdoor photography and was documenting our trips with genuine artistic skill. The Henderson boys, now teenagers who actually participated in conversations, had developed real camping abilities under patient instruction. But the biggest change was in me. The carefully maintained separation between my past and present had dissolved, replaced by something more integrated and honest. I'd kept my promise to make those phone calls, and now spent weekends training volunteer search and rescue teams throughout Illinois and Wisconsin. My Chicago apartment was filled with maps and emergency equipment again, and my calendar included regular deployments to assist with missing person cases. "Aunt Sarah, look what I learned," Emma called out, demonstrating a proper bowline knot with the confidence of someone who'd been practicing regularly. "Perfect technique," I told her, and meant it. At 9 years old, she was developing real outdoor skills rather than just camping entertainment. Jenny approached as I finished checking everyone's gear. You seem different, happier. I am, I admitted. It turns out that running from who you are is exhausting. Using your abilities for something meaningful is energizing. Even when it means carrying that responsibility again? I looked around at our group, at people who'd learned to respect expertise while developing their own competence, at relationships built on honest capability rather than artificial roles. The responsibility feels different when it's chosen rather than imposed, when it comes from wanting to help rather than having to be the answer to everything. Martinez appeared from the ranger station, grinning as he approached our group. "Annual return of the famous Major Thompson expedition," he announced cheerfully. "Just Sarah's family camping trip," I corrected, though I was smiling too. "Sarah's family camping trip where everyone actually knows what they're doing now," he replied. "It's refreshing to see a group that's properly prepared and genuinely competent." We spent the weekend demonstrating just how much everyone had learned. Derek led navigation exercises with real skill and appropriate caution. Patricia taught the others about wilderness photography while maintaining proper safety protocols. The boys helped younger campers learn basic skills without the superiority that had once characterized Derek's teaching style. And I found myself able to relax in ways I'd never experienced before. I could enjoy the outdoors without hiding my capabilities, participate in group activities without pretending incompetence, and offer guidance when needed without carrying the entire burden of everyone's safety. On our last evening, as we sat around a fire that Derek had built with genuinely impressive technique, Emma asked the question that had been developing all weekend. "Will you teach us more advanced stuff next time? Real survival techniques?" I looked around at their faces, at people who'd earned the right to learn more challenging skills through their demonstrated commitment to safety and competence. "What kind of advanced techniques?" "Navigation without GPS," Derek suggested immediately. "Weather prediction, emergency shelter construction, advanced first aid." "I'd like to learn about reading terrain for water sources," added Patricia. "And how to signal for rescue if communication equipment fails," Mike chimed in. These were serious requests from people who'd moved far beyond recreational camping toward genuine wilderness competence. They'd earned access to more advanced knowledge through their dedication to learning fundamental skills properly. "We can do that," I agreed. "But it means more preparation, more training between trips, and higher standards for safety and competence." "We're ready," Derek said immediately, and this time his confidence was based on demonstrated ability rather than assumed expertise. As we packed up the next morning, Martinez pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You know, the SAR community has been talking about you. Word gets around when someone with your background starts working with volunteer teams again." "Good things, I hope?" "Very good things. There's talk about developing a regional training program, maybe expanding beyond just volunteer coordination. Interested?" I considered the possibilities he was suggesting. More formal involvement in emergency response, expanded training responsibilities, perhaps even consultation on policy development. A year ago, the prospect would have terrified me. Now it felt like a natural evolution of the path I'd already chosen. "Send me the details," I said. "I'll consider it." The drive back to Chicago was different too. Instead of returning to a life that felt separate from everything meaningful, I was heading home to work that mattered and relationships that were built on honesty rather than carefully maintained facades. My phone buzzed with messages from other SAR coordinators, updates on ongoing training programs, and scheduling requests for upcoming deployments. The work had found me again, but this time on terms I could live with, in ways that honored both my capabilities and my need for balance. When Jenny asked if I was happy with how things had turned out, I thought about Jessica, safe at home because someone had been able to find her when she was lost. I thought about the volunteer searchers I'd trained, now equipped with skills that could save lives in their own communities. I thought about Derek and the others, no longer dependent on false expertise, but developing genuine competence. "Yes," I said simply. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be exactly who they need. Sometimes hiding your light under a bushel only makes it burn brighter when it's finally revealed. And sometimes coming home to yourself means accepting that your greatest capabilities are also your greatest responsibilities. The camping trip had ended, but the real journey was just beginning.